As we begin our exploration of a paradigm to explain paradigms, or a paradigm for dimensions, the first place to look at is the circle. And this is, of course, within the geometrical paradigm. And the reason that the circle is interesting is that it connects deeply with grace, with intelligence, with symmetry, with duality and a transcendence of duality. And our environment is circular, whether it's the atom or the planet or the solar system. We're dealing with a lot of circles. And one of the reasons that I think that the circle is perhaps the most significant shape in geometry is that it links with intelligence, which is the efficiency of transforming energy into well-being. And we can see that efficiency in the scientific choice of the wheel. We don't have square wheels. It would be violent and incredibly uncomfortable to drive 60 miles an hour with a car with square wheels. We have circular wheels because it takes less energy and creates less friction to move and transfer energy, to transport, to transfer energy from one place to another on a circular wheel than any other shape. And in moving through space, it takes less energy to move through space with a sphere. So there's a tremendous amount of support for the circle. Now, one of the things that so on an intelligence basis, or the basis of grace, kind of minimal effort for maximum result, the circle, the sphere, holds up well. The other area that's interesting is that we have polarity within human consciousness. And polarity in geometric terms could be determined by the dot and the line and the straight line and the curved line. So you've got different polarities here. You've got the dot and the circle. You have the dot and the line. You have the line and the circle. You have the particle and the wave. You have the individual and the group. The individual, the dot, the group, the circle, the environment. And you have, in physical terms as well as social terms, the individual and the ecology that supports and interconnects with the individual. And what's interesting about a circle is it is both one, which transcends polarity. Because one, the totality of everything, the one, to be one with all that is, to be one with the multiverse, the totality, to be one, is contained in the metaphor of the sphere. But within the construction of the sphere, you have, in computer models, an infinite number of dots or an infinite number of lines. It's basically as big as the processing power of the computer. That's how many lines or dots that you can construct and use to create the perfect circle. So the eye sees a circle, but if you refract the circle, it can be an infinite number of lines. And if you look closely, even on the chalk, what you see is not a circle. You see about 1,000 dots an inch. And it is the dots. It is the dots that have adhered to the chalkboard that create the illusion of a circle. It is an arrangement of dots in a circular pattern. So masculine and feminine, and because you have the wave and the particle, the curve and the straight line, the circle, the sphere, and all of the different dots that create it. But then you also have the oneness, the metaphor of that which transcends dots and lines. And that is always the sphere in which we are a part of. So we cannot experience a reality that is outside all known experience. We cannot imagine a reality that is outside all known experience. And just a little thought game along those lines, we have 5 observing and measuring devices. So this is an observing and measuring device that measures certain frequencies that we have named light. We could have named it pink, we could have named it zebra, but we named it light. So that's what it's measuring in certain bandwidths. Now, what we don't have is a measuring and observing device over here that counts right angles. So we count waves of light, but we don't count right angles. If we did have an observing and measuring device here that noticed right angles and counted them up during the day, and perhaps we would call that sense a zit. Why not? We just invent all these words. So if we had a zit that noticed and measured right angles, at the end of the day, we would say, what went on in your day? And the answer would be, well, there were 296,000 right angles in my day. And why would that have significance? Well, I'm sure either if you have the observing and measuring devices and focus on them, you can make up significance. We've made up significance in all kinds of things that are hard to connect with meaningful felt experience, but we do it anyway. And so we'd either make up a meaning or the sense would develop because there was some meaning. If you could imagine that there was some unique form of satisfaction, let's say that you have a unique aesthetic which finds pleasure in right angles. Well, if that's your orgasm, if your orgasm is finding more right angles and more beautiful and cleaner right angles than whatever is there before, and your brain stimulates pleasure because there's some connection between that and your biology and your evolution, well, then, of course, it would make sense to mark and measure that which correlates to well-being. Now, we only have 5 observing and measuring devices, and they only observe a very small amount of all there is to observe, which is to say that reality is vastly bigger than the human brain, than the human mind is capable of comprehending and understanding. The universe is vastly bigger than we are capable of understanding and comprehending. And so what do we do to understand the very little bit of the universe that we do think we understand? And I'd suggest that we create heuristic models of reality that we overlay on patterns of data that we can observe and invent dimensions through which to observe parts of reality in what could be called a grid. Now, think of the temperature grid. Now, obviously, we're all aware because we have nerves, one of our senses is the sense of touch, and one dimension that touch measures is temperature. So if I touch something that's hot, we say, oh, that's hot. And if we touch something that's cold, we say, oh, that's cold. And of course, there is an infinite temperature continuum. There is an infinite temperature continuum. And we can say that's hot, that's cold. Then we have degrees. Then we have centigrade and Fahrenheit degrees, which are different grids. They're different heuristic models of reality. Now, 68 degrees or 40 below zero is not reality. It is a point on a continuum that we use to relate to reality with a little bit more consciousness than if we just said medium and cold. So the grid that measures a given continuum, I represented in this vertical or longitudinal set of lines. And the horizontal grids relate to things like temperature. Now, why do we differentiate temperature from touch? Why do we say this is texture and this is temperature? And why not measure something like apprehension of touch? Because certainly, if we've been shocked recently when we've touched various things, we might have an apprehension of touch, a tingling sensation. Why don't we measure the degree of tingling or apprehension or expectation? Why don't we measure other things than what we measure? And why don't we go down into more nuance? Why don't we zoom in more and use language, which is one of the dimensions of perception, to do so? And I would suggest that while the spatial surface of reality, just like the spatial surface of the Earth, is infinite. Now, how do you know it's infinite? Well, first of all, you say this is a space, and you say, okay, how big is that? Well, you overlay a heuristic model of reality, because really how big it is depends on how small you are. Because if I'm very small, it's very big, and if I'm very big, it's very small. But we say, okay, we want an objective measurement of reality. So we say, okay, that's 1 meter. Is 1 meter big or is 1 meter small? Well, it depends on how big we're experiencing that meter from, one. It also depends on how significant that meter is to our well-being. If that's a meter of money, a meter of $100 bills, it may seem like a very big meter. If it is a meter of sand, it may seem like a very small amount of sand, particularly if we need several hundred yards of sand. So is it big? Is it small? Well, it is a meter. So that's what it is. And you say, okay, this is a meter. Well, what's half of a meter? Well, it's half a meter. And what's half of that? Well, a quarter of a meter. What's a millimeter? Well, it's 1,000th of a meter. Well, can you take a millimeter and cut it in half? Okay, now you've got half a millimeter. And can you take that and cut it in half and you say it's a quarter of a millimeter? Now, we don't have language for a quarter of a millimeter. So we say it's 1/4 or 25% of this reference point. But why doesn't it have its own name? And what if you take a quarter of 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 a millimeter? Is there still a smaller space than that? Well, of course. What if you take half of that? Well, now what do you have? Is it the end? No, because what if you took half of that? Space is infinite. We're just satisfied once we get it down in an approximate amount using a heuristic map of reality. Now, time is infinite. No. It's just an hour. What about half of an hour? It's just a moment. Well, what about half of a moment? What about a millionth of a millionth of a millionth of a millionth of a moment? It's already gone. I can't keep track of it. Okay, I can't keep track of it, so it's not real. it doesn't have impact on me. I can't keep track of a millionth of a moment, and so I'm not going to name it. I'm certainly not going to try and relate to an increment of time that is that small. I'm not going to try and relate to a millionth of a millimeter. I'm not going to try and relate to a millionth of a moment. But just because I don't want to relate to it, does it mean it's not there or isn't having impact? So what's going on? And how do we relate to infinity? Because that's kind of this paradox of the circle and the sphere. The circle and the sphere are an infinite number of dots, an infinite number of lines, and at the same moment they're one. They're complete on their own. Okay, so we're going to go through this relatively rapid, so a rather fast pass from kind of an aerial high view, and then perhaps we'll come back and go into more detail later. So what is God? What is Goddess? What is all that is? Well, it's another word for the energy patterns that are more complex than we are, certainly more complex than we can imagine and relate to. The masculine and feminine tension, the black and the white, the up and the down, the negative and positive, the point and the circle, the wave and the particle. So you have this polarity. And that which is at the edge of the masculine polarity or the yang polarity, the particle, the line, the dot, we call God. It's the ultimate expression. No, of course it's not the ultimate expression. It's the limited current rendition that we are capable of imagining that represents the masculine polarity of an archetype. An archetype being a symbol of a place that we're moving towards that's always changing. Because by the time that we become God, as we imagined it 2,000 years ago, God is now something else, more complex, bigger than we could have imagined before. And we can see that in the evolution of God, which has occurred in, the Judeo-Christian ethic, where, if you remember, God was all-powerful. Well, at the time that God was called all-powerful, 2,000 years ago, let's say, we are already considered gods. For example, if you and I walk into a 2,000-year-old version of time and show this phone and show this setup and mention things like the internet and Ethernet ports and all of this type of stuff, this is already God. God was all-powerful in a way that we are already individually more powerful than many people could imagine of God just 2,000 years ago. Now, God was all-knowing. Well, thanks to Google and other search engines and smartphones, we would be considered all-knowing by someone 2,000 years ago. Now, we don't, of course, know anything at all. In fact, the fact that we know as much as we know allows us to know how little we know. What's the distance between star Z25 and star T102? We now know that there are multiverses, and we haven't even figured out all there is to know about the universe, let alone, or the galaxy, let alone the universe. And so the more one knows, the more one understands one doesn't know. So God has to get bigger, because God is the archetypal doorway towards the masculine polarity. It's the archetypal rendition in human consciousness. In other words, we have never seen God. We've seen archetypal renditions that our brains and cultures and consciousness were capable of understanding at the time. Because the true totality of all there is far bigger than thought, belief, imagination can hold. And these observing and measuring devices certainly could not, hold the totality of that. So we never see God, but we seek that which is more complex, that which is more sophisticated than ourselves. Now, in a patriarchal culture, of course, we have not been tracking the goddess as much as God. In a cult in which, or a species in which, in a time in which all of the main religions lack an equal or supreme feminine figure, we can see that feminine energy, the goddess, the yin, is undervalued at this point. So this is, if goddess energy was a stock, Warren Buffett would be buying it because it's undervalued. And you buy low and you sell high, and you get symmetry in that way. So goddess is the archetype capable of being imagined within human consciousness, and is, of course, more than that. And the all that is the unipolar force. So you have this polarity, and then you have this unity of the whole before it was split in half, and that's kind of the all that is. So you have the God, the goddess, the all that is. And here you have a Trinity, so to speak, the black, the white, and the circle that unites them, and the rainbow that exists in between. So, as we try and relate with reality, we're relating to the God, goddess, all that is, of which we are a part. Because God and goddess is simply the extreme archetypal energy that we're capable of imagining at the time, and we're connected to that. We're connected to that. We're not all knowing and we're not all powerful, but we're a lot more knowing and a lot more powerful than we were 2,000 years ago. And that's the reason why God and goddess are sacred. The reason that the ideal is sacred is that it propels us towards them. If we had not had the ideal of being all-knowing, of being more like God, we would not have sought out encyclopedias and printing presses originally, and then computers, and then phones, and then Wikipedia. Why would we go to all that work except that we want to be all-knowing? We want to be closer to God as we define that. And so we work to become closer to something. And similarly, we want to feel good. We want to be alive. We want to be sensuous. We want to feel awake. And so we do yoga, and we eat a different diet. We go out in nature and we sense the moment because we yearn to be closer to the goddess. We yearn to enter the timeless space before it was broken down into little boxes to imprison us. And so we yearn for this dance between the masculine and feminine. And so the way that we relate to ourselves, to God, goddess, all that is, to reality, whatever metaphor that you want to use, is through a heuristic map that's dumbed down to the point that seems relevant to us. So here's some of the dimensions. We have language and thought. Now, language and thought go together because you cannot think a thought without language. Now, language also determines the density of consciousness. Language equals the pixelation density of consciousness. So, for example, 4,000 4K, which is kind of the current standard in audio visual. If you can get a 4K camera, it just means 4,000 dots per inch. Now, one could think of a 4K language would be 4,000 words a second. Now, if you could communicate reality at 4,000 words a second, the vitality of consciousness would be the equivalent of 4K on the eyes. Now, we have not learned to do this because we have not learned to speak and listen that fast. But it's one of the interesting things that some of the ayahuasqueros who open up into regions of the brain that supersede language in order to visually communicate. There are images that happen at that density of 4K a second that transmit meanings faster than we're able to listen to them. But words shape thought, and the density and complexity of word lead to the dimensionality of thought. Poetry, in our framework, is the densest form of communication because you can speak 5 things at once with a single sentence. When I say, the bird sings on a high note before falling, bloody and whimpering to the ground below. You see, the question is, what do I mean by that? Are we talking about sorrow? Are we talking about polarity of joy and pain? What is the meaning? And the answer is all of it, because it's so short, and yet 1,000 people can look at a painting, can read a poem, and hear different things. And this gives it density. Can listen to a Beethoven symphony and feel different nuances and notice different things at different times, and then discover 10 years later that you never heard this one instrument. And so, language and thought is a dimension that is as dense, that is as pixelated as one's vocabulary and use of it. Now, color and light. You have color and light as the dimension. You have hue, intensity, luminosity, density, and range on the light spectrum as the vertical grid. Paradigms are itself a dimension of reality because everything we're talking about is a paradigm. A dimension is a paradigm. It's a lens through which to see through. Language is a paradigm, and one doesn't understand that language is a paradigm until you've spoken 3 or 4 languages. Then you understand that you think differently in this language than you do in this language. And very interestingly, in this grid pattern, let's say there is a cross point in the English language that says warm fireplace. Well, it's 2, warm and fireplace. So here you are in English. But you see, in Denmark, because one of the things that you have when you create any grid in consciousness, you have these spaces in between. Now, if you're trying to have 2 ships meet in the mid-ocean, longitude and latitude are adequate, because you're not going to meet at the exact inch. You're going to get within a few hundred yards of one another on your longitude-latitude meter, You're going to say, oh, there you are. And from that point, you're not going to look at the meter. You're going to look at the other ship. You're going to transform your focus from the longitude-latitude calculator over to a new form of reference, which is going to take you all the way where you need to go, which is finally having people on the edge of the boat so they rubber tires in between them so you can get up to one another and transfer things back and forth without bashing the ships together. So this, or maybe you'll send dinghies back and forth. So the longitude-latitude calculators are not designed to the millimeter. So they can't guide you to the millimeter. But your sight can guide you to the millimeter. And language cannot guide you into this area. If you've got a grid that looks like this and you want to meet in this middle area, your language will not take you there. Now you can improvise. You can say it's warm, but it's not like warm. It's like this. It's to the left of warm. What are you talking about? Well, it's to the left of warm. Can you sense it? Can you feel it? Can you go there? You'll look around. Is there any way that I can get what that means? But if your grid is, in this case, 1.5 inches by 1 inch, you can't get into the middle of that space. If your vocabulary doesn't allow penetration of that domain, you can't go there. But here's the interesting thing. We're dealing with English here. And as we translate the same terrain from another language, they don't have the grid on exactly the same point in a lot of areas. So the Finnish language may go right through this space and go here. And so as Finnish is translated into English, the intersection that takes place here is moved down to here to accommodate the closest reference point in the other person's language. So you're now dealing with reality like this. Now, if you have two languages, you can meet in the middle here in Finnish, and you can meet over here in English, and here in English. But you couldn't get there in English, or it would be very difficult and you'd have to luck out to both end up in that zone, in that particular location. So this is the grid of language. And if there isn't a word for something, you can't go there. If there isn't a paradigm for something, you can't create a word to go there, even if there is a paradigm. You have to have a paradigm. And a good way of looking at this is in relationships, where you think of you're attracted to someone and they're attracted to you. Okay, so you want to get together, and you assume that you're on the same page, right? But one person wants to have an open relationship, meaning 3 or 4 partners, and the other person wants to have a monogamous relationship. So they're off on that paradigm. The open monogamy bit isn't clear, and so they're not going to connect. Or if they do connect, there'll be pain involved because they won't see each other clearly. Now, one person has a paradigm of live on fully, dive in fully, etc., and that the worst thing that one can possibly do is waste a day. And so tears or joy, I'm diving in, I'm living to the fullest. That's their strategy, the paradigm of their strategy. Their fear is of wasting a day. Their goal is to live fully. Now, the other person's fear is pain. And their goal is to go as slowly as possible to understand where pain might come from and avoid the pain. So they're not going to connect there either. And they're not going to know in our culture that they're not going to connect there because we don't have a way to preemptively connect paradigms. And dating sites do a little bit of this, but one of the trouble of dating sites is they don't show the full picture. They don't differentiate between the person who's a Republican because blah, 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 and the person who's a Democrat because blah, 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 and the Democrat that's this way because of this other thing. So there's a lot of reduction and dumbing down of the complexity of the human being. And you can see that because the reality is that there's always something bigger than the little boxes we try and put each other in. But we often don't leave room for that. For example, if you ask a lot of Johnny Depp fans, would you date Johnny Depp? Well, a lot of Johnny Depp fans, particularly females, would. And then you say, yeah, but your dating app says you would never date anyone who was a Democrat. And Johnny's a Democrat. They're like, oh, I don't care about that. It's Johnny Depp, right? And then you say, and you said you'd never date anyone with a gun. And Johnny Depp has a firearm collection. Oh, it doesn't matter. It's so the point is, we're good at dumbing people down to certain fixed points, but we're not good at transcending and understanding when, in which situation, is something big enough that it transcends the individual myopia of our preferences and criticisms. Now, feelings and emotions, first of all, we need to know what the difference is. You know, in an emotionally illiterate culture, many of us don't know the difference between a thought, between a feeling. Sometimes you say, what do you feel? And someone tells you what they think. And you say, what are you feeling? And they share an emotion. So there are these distinctions that need to be mapped out. And then there are continuums of intensity, of duration. So you have intensity in the moment, and then you have duration over time, which adds to intensity of the moment to generate, a square of impact. Duration multiplied by intensity equals impact of a given feeling. And then you have the fact that whatever it is you're feeling intersects with your environment and intersects with your memories and your biology. So you have all these intersecting points in feelings. So these are dimensions. You have paradigms. Now, geometry is a dimension. And mathematics is a dimension. And dreams are a dimension. And imagination is a dimension. And biology is a dimension. Electricity is a dimension. Mythology, increments of measurement, interrelatedness, and increments of interrelatedness, space and time, these are all dimensions. And see, we can create 1 billion dimensions. And each dimension we create, which in a certain sense will be limited to our language, will have a probability field and a possibility field and an actual location. So as we interact with our feelings, if we're connected to the feeling dimension, there will be something we're feeling right now at a certain intensity. And that will connect with our past, with our projected future, and with the environment around us. So if we're a mathematician, and we understand that someone feels 20% anger, 30% joy, and we start to break it down. I'm angry that this happened. I'm joyful that this happened. I'm grateful that that happened. I'm scared that this might happen. If it's broken down and feelings are assigned to particular patterns of energy, the observer can learn as much about the environment from the feelings as they learn about the person feeling them, and vice versa. And so there's a connectedness. And some dimensions that exist are unconscious and thus not real to us because we don't have a sensory measuring device to see them, or they don't fit within the paradigm. For example, it's very funny to watch the degree of ignorance and willful incompetence of many scientists who ignore anomalous data, because almost every system in the history of systems is plagued by a certain static, by a certain amount of anomalous data that is not consistent with the system. And systems are important because they give confidence and flow, but they don't work in that no system is perfect. And so we need systems, and we rely on systems that threaten to become dogmatic when we're too flippant about ignoring and reducing the anomalous data that doesn't fit within the bounds of the system.